A very good afternoon to everybody present here. We at ORF are organizing a special panel on foreign fighters in South Asia. We have here a distinguished panel of experts who are looking at different countries within South Asia. So briefly to set the introductions, we have Shafi Mostafa, who's a professor at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. We have Sushant Sareen, who's a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, who specializes in Pakistan. We have Ms. Anju Gupta, who is a career law enforcement and security researcher who's worked on India very specifically. And we have Ms. Chayanika Saxena, who is currently in her final year at the National University of Singapore doing her PhD, and she specializes in Afghanistan. I'm Mohammed Sinan Siyech. I am a non-resident associate fellow at ORF, and I'm also a PhD scholar at the University of Edinburgh at this moment. So welcome everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. And we are here to just discuss the issue of foreign fighters, something that is generating a lot of interest, has been generating a lot of interest, has had a lot of impact on all nations in South Asia. And even now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict at this point, we also have a lot of discussions going on over there with regards to foreign fighters. So just for the benefit of the audience, I would like to just give a brief definition of what is a foreign fighter. Essentially, they are described as a non-citizen of a certain state who joins insurgencies during civil conflict. And a few classifications or a few characteristics regarding a foreign fighter is that it is a person who has joined and operates within the confines of an insurgency, who lacks citizenship in the conflict state or any kinship to its warring factions, and he or she lacks any affiliation to an official military organization, and largely is unpaid. So some examples that we have had of previous foreign fighters, taking part in different conflicts is, for example, Afghanistan in the 1980s, when a lot of people from across the world traveled and fought against the Soviet Union forces at that point. We also have the case study of Syria, which is among the most recent, where a lot of people, again, from across the world, including Europe, including Russia, including the Arab nations, moved into Syria to go ahead and fight Bashar al-Assad. So these are some examples of foreign fighters. What we felt is that this discussion of foreign fighters is very limited within the South Asian scope, and we thought that it would be a good idea to bring in people who focus on South Asia to speak about the specific topic. So with that, I'd like to start with Anju ma'am, who is our specialist on India. And what could you tell us, in the next few minutes about foreign fighters in India? How have we dealt with this threat? How do we deal with what comes forward moving on from here? And how are we prepared, for this threat in the future? So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, San. The issue of foreign fighters, if you look at India, actually it's all started even before the first Afghan jihad. And as much as I would not like to bring in Pakistan into this discussion, I think the topic that you have given, I'll have to talk about it, because essentially the foreign fighters who've been fighting in India, predominantly, majority of them are Pakistanis. We have seen them in Kashmir. That is not to say that we don't have, homegrown or local groups, but largely our trouble has the foreign fighters that we have seen in India are of Pakistani origin. They fought in Kashmir. We've seen how they have worked in mainland. We've seen number of terrorist attacks across our cities in India, where we've seen role of Pakistani militants. What they normally call Punjabi Taliban, the Punjabi groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji. So you've seen these groups which are actually based in Pakistan, and a lot of them actually came out of first Afghan jihad to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and in turn they started moving towards India. And so this remains our principal challenge. This has been the main challenge. So the foreign fighters that we've seen in India are largely Pakistanis. We've seen some Bangladeshis, I would say, but very few. We've seen the role of some Bangladeshis, and I'm sure Mr. Shafi Mohammed will be well aware of this. So some are Bangladeshis. Apart from these two, we have seen the role of, some Sikh terrorists, which may not have been Indian citizens, but based abroad in Pakistan or in Western countries. We've seen their role also. So technically, they are also foreign fighters. We have seen the role of Sri Lankan Tamils, who have, created violence in India. Technically, they are also foreign fighters. We have seen the roles of very few Maldivians, very few. They are also technically foreign fighters. But while a lot of them have been, come and go, it is the Pakistanis that have, continued to be a principal challenge to India in terms of foreign fighters. So this is, in short, if I have to describe foreign fighters that have affected India, this is the group we are talking about. But yes, if we are looking at foreign fighters, how they have grown in our region, well, it all started with first Afghan Jihad. And we know the first Afghan Jihad, 1979 to 89, was actually a result of the Cold War between the US camp and the USSR. And how we've seen that after Russian invasion of Afghanistan, US used Pakistan as a frontline state, and Pakistan very willingly offered itself as a frontline state. And now Al-Qaeda brought the Arab foreign fighters into the region. We've seen how other South Asian countries send their nationals to fight there. We've seen how Southeast Asian countries nationals gravitated towards Afghanistan and also the Central Asian. So the first Afghan Jihad actually created a narrative of foreign fighters in a technical sense, in a modern sense. And from there, we have seen that while a lot of these foreign fighters went back to their countries and created more trouble, a lot of them stayed back in AFPAC. And that is how the world, the destiny of Afghanistan and Pakistan got linked in terms of this. Now for India, this was the starting point, is first Afghan Jihad, where groups like LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, they were actually created to fight this jihad. And they were largely manned by Punjabi Pakistanis. And after the Russians withdrew, after the Americans withdrew from, in 1989, a whole lot of these groups were diverted towards India. And that is something which has continued, apart from the fact that they continue to be active even in Afghanistan, even today. So I guess in short, this is how the picture for India looks like.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Sushant sir, if I can go over to you, ma'am had mentioned about how Pakistan and a lot of individuals from Pakistan had played a big role within India and threatened national security for India. How do these same group of people also affect Pakistan's security as well? And what could you discuss about that, and in terms of their history, in terms of their impact? Any thoughts that you may have over here? And I leave the floor open to you.
Yeah, thanks. And just tell me when I've taken my full complement of time. So yeah, I agree with what Anju Gupta is saying, that at least in India, bulk of the foreign fighters are from Pakistan. But Pakistan is a very unique country in the sense that there are not many countries in the world which are both sending foreign fighters into other countries, their own nationals who then become foreigners who go and fight in other countries, and a recipient of foreign fighters who come into their country. I don't think there are very many examples of this. Maybe Syria now, because we are hearing that Syrians are going and fighting in Ukraine, but by and large, we haven't seen much of this phenomena anywhere else. So in that sense, Pakistan has been unique. As far as the landscape of how the foreign fighters have operated, yes, that's true that you can really trace the origins of this whole phenomena to what happened, in the 1980s, the late 70s, early 80s. And then going forward, this has just, kind of snowballed into something much bigger. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, the foreign fighters really started becoming active inside Pakistan operationally. They were always present, but operationally, I think, to my mind, the first big incident that I can remember is the bombing of the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad, which was, I think, in 95 or thereabouts. before that, there aren't many examples of any military or militant operations by the foreign fighters inside Pakistan. And that was because in large part, the Pakistani state and many of these foreign fighters were working in conjunction. The other aspect I think we should keep in mind is that the Pakistani state has been very careful on how it has used these foreign fighters. For example, in Kashmir, there have been some Afghans who have come in, but not too many. And I'm talking about the really bad days of the 90s. But in recent years, or at least in this century, we haven't seen many Afghans or non-Pakistani foreign fighters coming into Kashmir. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the Pakistanis feel that they can control their own citizens who go as foreign fighters much better than they can control the foreigners whom they send or who they deploy. So that's the other factor. But again, there are serious problems of command and control, even with people whom they call their own fighters. And we've seen that happen in Pakistan. The third aspect of this is that most of the foreign fighters in Pakistan have generally avoided carrying operations in what, if I was to divide Pakistan vertically in what you can call cis-Indus and trans-Indus, most of the foreign fighters have been active in the trans-Indus areas, and that also in a small belt, mostly in the former FATA and now what is called the tribal districts. And that also, they became operationally very active post 9/11. And they started getting into clashes. But before that, and even after that, in large parts of Pakistan, most of these foreign fighters would come for recruitment. They would come for refuge. They would come for rest and recuperation. And they would come to collect some resources. So it was these 5 R's which kind of motivated the foreign fighters coming into Pakistan. Operationally, they were active only in the FATA belt. And we've seen clashes between the Uzbeks and the Pakistani security forces, inflicting very, very heavy damage on the Pakistani security forces. We've seen a smattering of these characters coming into Pakistan. So it's been the Arabs, of course, it's been the Afghans, but maybe by your definition, Sinan, I don't know if you will treat the Afghans coming into that region as foreign fighters, because technically they have tribal affiliations and all of that. But even if you were to ignore the Afghans, there were the Arabs, there were the Dagestanis. There are some reports of Chechens coming in. There have been Indonesians involved. There have been Malaysians involved. You name it, those characters have been there. So these guys have mostly come in. Sometimes they've had these pitched battles, but other than that, they've not been very active operationally. You also had the Uyghurs who have come in, but mostly not to carry out operations inside Pakistan. But then I think when the Chinese started putting pressure on the Pakistanis, they kind of bummed off, some of these, the ETIM leadership. They were killed in encounters. All encounters were mostly fake. So they kind of tried to eliminate them, but there is an ETIM presence inside Pakistan, but that works more or less in conjunction with these other characters. The other aspect of the foreign fighters, and these are Pakistani foreign fighters, is how the rise of what is now called the Zenubian Brigade. The Iranians have used the Pakistani Shias, and we have seen a phenomena of what is called the missing persons, young Shia men being picked up from Karachi and other places and disappeared because they have some contact or the other with somebody who might be involved with the Zenubian Brigade. So the Zenubian Brigade is essentially centered around Pakistani Shias. And these are guys who have gone and fought in various theaters in which Iran has been involved. They've used the Fatimiyun Brigade for the Afghans, but the Zenubian Brigade is, of course, the Pakistani foreign fighters. You've also had Sunni Pakistanis going and fighting in Syria. There's not too much data in the public domain, but there have been, the odd remark. If you look at some of the newspapers, there's been the odd memorial service being held for somebody. There have been a couple of comments where, people have claimed that there is a Abdul Rashid Ghazi camp in Syria where some of these guys have gone and got training and then have been deployed in Syria. But there is not too much information in the public domain as far as the Sunni fighters with the ISIS and other groups are concerned. Of course, then there is the entire phenomena of the Pakistanis. And this time I'm not talking about the Pashtuns, So even if I don't like these academic definitions which you guys come up with, but even if I was to take out the Pashtuns from it, the fact that there are the Punjabis and other Pakistani ethnic groups going into Afghanistan and becoming part of the IS KP and fighting out there, and of course then coming back. So in a sense, there has been a lot of toing and froing between these groups, both the local ones who have received state patronage and the foreign element which has more or less worked in tandem with them. The other aspect of this is that, and which is something which worries me hell of a lot, it's not so much the presence of these guys coming into into India. More than that, it is how these guys exchange notes in terms of tactics, in terms of technologies of terror, in terms of various other ways in which they operate. And we've seen a lot of that toing and froing between various theaters of war and many of these so-called foreign fighters who come and then give some degree of support, some degree of organization, perhaps finances to most of these guys. So yes, it does have a serious impact on the ability of the state to control these guys. But this is what Pakistan will have to face even more going forward, as we are seeing over the last 1 year or so with the sudden spike in attacks, which many of them can be perhaps attributed to foreign fighters. So I'll end out here. I hope I haven't violated your time.
Thank you so much. I think you've really gone into a lot of different verticals within the discussion of foreign fighters, and I think you're right. Like within the South Asian context, sometimes we need to rethink some of the definitions that come out here, right? We don't want to be pigeonholed into saying that these guys are foreign fighters, but these aren't. So keeping that in mind, right, and keeping the two discussions in mind, Mr. Shafi, I'll go on to you. Given that we've had some interest, but not a lot, from Bangladeshis within the last few years. But the numbers were a lot higher back in the 1980s, 1990s. So correct me if I'm wrong, like, is there why are these numbers different, and what are the sort of, what are the sort of trends that you've seen from a Bangladeshi perspective for the nation and, outside of it as well?
Thank you, Sinan. I would say Bangladesh is relatively a new secular nation state in South Asia. But even though it is a new, but since the 1980s, immediately after it got independence in 1971 from Pakistan, I just recently come across that piece of information. Even no information is available on that. The Palestinian war that attracted nearly 8,000 Bangladeshis, and they went there fighting for the Palestine, and they fought in the war against the Israel. And surprisingly, why I'm saying that the conflicts in Middle East, to my understanding of Bangladesh's radicalization or Bangladesh's military landscape, what I find that conflicts in Middle East, it's very closely interlinked with the rise of different waves of militancy in Bangladesh. So what happens during the 1980s, nearly 8,000 Bangladeshis, they went there to fight for the Palestinians. Surprisingly, most of them, they did not come back. They still in Libya, in different parts of Middle East. Still they are there, they settled over there. Maybe from there they seek refuge in different parts of the world, but they did not come back. And that is why we did not feel the immediate impact of the foreign fighters in their home countries. But what we have seen in 1986, the formation of the first militant organization, that is the Muslim Millat Bahini, by retired army major, and from that, and he was fighting for the Islamic State of Sharia law, something like that. And police, after few days operation, police discovered 27 passport with visas of different Middle East countries. That means that there is a deep connection in terms of what is happening in the Middle East and the militant connection in the country. So we find a very strong connection here, but until that point, 1986, 1987, we don't have enough evidence that who fought in the Palestinian war, who came back. We don't have information to that extent. But this is very clear, the events in Middle East that affected the militant landscape in the country. Coming back to the Afghanistan war against the Russia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. During that time, we have, so available information says nearly 4,000 Bangladeshis. They traveled to Afghanistan and they fought for the Taliban. And what happens actually after their win, actually, they came back to Bangladesh. And we have seen in the slogans in the street, in Bengali, the slogans like Amra Hobo, Amra Holam Taliban, Bangladesh Hobe Afghanistan. So in English, it can be like that. We are all Talibans and the Bangladesh will become the Afghanistan. So even these slogans were so popular in the street in the 1990s. And I can also remember from my childhood experience, I was that those who came back fighting Afghanistan in Bangladesh, they were warmly welcomed in the society. You can easily understand that how the people felt for the Afghanistan, for Taliban during that time, and they were warmly welcomed. And what happened after that? They openly declared the formation of several extremist organizations, and they even in a press conference in the National Press Club. so they just not secretly doing something. So in 1991, they openly declared the formation of several organizations. So I call actually from 1986 up to the 2001, I call this period of formation. And a lot of, there is a long list. Some says nearly 100 organizations that they support Sharia-based organizations. They support to some extent the military activities. So that 4,000 people, they came back with a lot of source of funding and networking, and with the ideology, and they know how to win against the infidel. So they have that kinds of inspiration, and that's why we saw the series of formation of series of Islamist organizations, and there is another shift after that. And then for the period nearly 5 years, 2001 to 2007, there are a lot of operations on the part of JMB, JMJB, or other militant organizations. So what happened in 2007? All the leading leaders were executed by the government. And then we see there is a silent phase. And after that, we have seen again that there is a conflict in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Syria, and the invasion of Afghanistan by the US. So all these things together, again, the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then we see previously the Afghan warriors, the Afghan fighters, were actually from the madrasas. They were madrasa students, and especially the Qaumi madrasa student. And what happens after that, and this trend, especially after 2013 or 14, after the declaration of the Caliphate, and this wave of militants, they are actually from the secular organizations. They are no longer from the madrasa students, and they're not poor people. They are middle class and upper class. They have the upper class background, because of uh, the diaspora involvement in this wave of militancy. So again, what I want to say again, the conflicts in Middle East that has also attracted a new type of militant challenges to the country. So this time, nearly 40 Bangladesh is not so many, number is not so big, but nearly 40 or 50 individuals that travel to Iraq and Syria, they fight for the ISIS. And, and maybe from other parts of the world, nearly 100 Bangladesh diaspora members, they travel to Iraq and Syria fighting for the ISIS. So, and nearly 10 people, Bangladeshis, they died over there, but some managed to come back to Bangladesh. Some are in the prison, and some are still missing. So they might create another challenge for the country as well as for the South Asian militant landscape. And this is where the government needs to focus on. So I think I should stop here, and we will discuss it later. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shafi. So, everyone's been talking, and all three of you all have spoken about Afghanistan as a focal point in the 1980s and also a little bit later, which is why we come to you, Ms. Chayanika, about, Afghanistan. And right now, especially with the Taliban, this was a group that at one point had encouraged people to come and join them, but now they're on the opposite end of the spectrum, right, where they are governing and they don't want any foreign fighters to come in and join groups like the ISKP, the Islamic State of Khorasan province, right? So what do you see in terms of how this landscape has changed, how the Taliban looks at it, A, from a governance perspective, and B, from a security perspective? We'd love your thoughts for the next 8 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinan, and thank you so much, everyone, for your very wonderful comments. In fact, most of the points that I wanted to cover have been covered by you, Sinan, and the previous speakers as well. So I'll just try to build upon whatever that's been spoken thus far. I think the ordering of the panel is pretty, I would say, opportune to the extent that we've had discussions on Afghanistan. So regardless of the countries we've spoken about, whether it was India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, Afghanistan happens to be the country that is at the center of everything going wrong, unfortunately, in South Asia. Although obviously geopolitical reasons are responsible for making Afghanistan what it is today, but we cannot deny the fact that Afghanistan happens to be the primary space where the foreign fighters have fought, and from where foreign fighters have gone to different parts of South Asia. So in fact, as Sinan, you've covered already, what we are seeing in Afghanistan is this emergence of an interesting, if not entirely a strange situation, where an organization which was hitherto responsible for insurgency in Afghanistan is now responsible for providing security to the country. And interestingly, I came across this anecdotal information by, I think, the head of the so-called intelligence chief of the Taliban. I think if I am getting his name right, it's Bashir Mal. So this guy had said that 90%, 95% of Afghanistan territory is today safe. Only 5% of the threat basically comes from thieves and thugs who have managed to get their hands on the American arsenal, and they're basically trying to rob people at gunpoint. Now, what is interesting is that we have seen a reported decrease in the number of attacks that have been conducted in Afghanistan. So unlike, say, the 2020s or the 2021 in the initial half of it, well, we have seen a drastic decline in the number of attacks and the intensity of attacks that have taken place in Afghanistan, which kind of begs this question as to whether the ISIS actually exists the way it is claimed to exist in Afghanistan. The Taliban says that it does not exist at all. It's just nothing but a phony kind of illusion, and ISIS does not exist and it does not really pose a threat. But then the Sanctions Committee of the United Nations has a very different take on it, and they would say that the ISKP very much exists in Afghanistan. And so is the case with Al-Qaeda. Although their numbers happen to the number of people associated with Al-Qaeda or the AQIS is pretty less compared to the number of people who are generally believed to be associated with the ISIS. But the geographical dispersion of Al Qaeda is about about at a 50% rate. So you have 15 out of 34 provinces in Afghanistan that currently witness some or the other kind of training camps. They have the geographical dispersion of this particular organization is such that it seems to be scattered in different parts of Afghanistan. What is also interesting about Afghanistan currently is the fact that the Taliban is trying to deal with this with such movements, with such organizations it finds itself in this kind of a strange catch-22, because it just cannot support the organizations which it had been involved with previously, but at the same time it just cannot let them go either, for two simple reasons: because of disaffection, because this disaffection can basically result in the creation of other organizations or groups within Afghanistan, which can then pose a greater security challenge or can pose challenge to the governance and the rule of the Taliban. And at the same time, we're dealing with organizations which have apparently had historical association with the Taliban, and they just cannot simply let them go for the fear of implosion. The Taliban can itself implode for the simple reason that there are certain groups, and I think I borrow from your observations in ORF Insight as well, that there are certain groups within the Taliban which do not feel very sympathetic towards what the Taliban has been doing. And in fact, certain groups who claim themselves to be associated with the ISIS, they believe that the Taliban is not purely an Islamic entity. It has done things in the past which it does not really want to condone. So these aspects, I think, along with the fact that there is a spiraling humanitarian crisis which is brewing in Afghanistan, creates a kind of a situation where the humanitarian crisis, the lack of governance, wherewithal, the lack of administrative capacity can once again make Afghanistan a hotbed of extremism, it has been so in the last 40 years, and it's quite likely that the situation would become even worse in the days to come, particularly as people would have no other option but to choose sides in order to just survive, in order to just live the other day. So I think that's one of the points that I wanted to highlight, and most of the stuff that we've discussed so far, whether it is about the infiltration of foreign fighters from and to Afghanistan during the Afghan Jihad, that's been covered by almost every panelist, and which is why I think we kind of need to focus on Afghanistan a lot more, and not, despite the fact that the United States has left Afghanistan and it might be back in one form or the other, we just cannot let Afghanistan slip from our sight, for the simple reason that this happens to be a kind of like a territory which is governed by an amorphous institution which does not have the administrative wherewithal to keep the country intact. It does not have economic resources which can make sure that people do not end up resorting to tactics and techniques which can fuel more extremism, which can fuel a kind of civil war, which would then result in another kind of in another chaos, which would then attract people from across the world to come and make Afghanistan a place which it had become in the 1990s, and which was the hotbed of extremism. So I guess overall, what is happening in Afghanistan is a major governance crisis, also an economic crisis, and a major humanitarian crisis. And our focus really needs to go back to this humanitarian aspect of the situation in Afghanistan, which needs to be addressed for its own sake and not only as a byproduct of the geopolitical crisis that it might result into. So I think with that, I can put my comments to rest. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you on with the questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chayanika. I mean, I think you're right. At the end of the day, a lot of issues related to terrorism and extremism specifically arise because of many governance, socioeconomic issues as well, apart from other issues of radicalization, right? So, keeping in mind that and I'll go on to Ms. Anju at this point to ask a question over there. Keeping in mind that Ms. Anju, you had mentioned that we've had a lot of people from Pakistan coming in. There's also the discussion that has taken place with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, where we've had Indians. We've had this one group of people go and join, Afghanistan, like from Kerala specifically. But we've also had people from Mumbai. We've had people from other parts of Karnataka, for example, who've been in Iraq and Syria as well. So what do you see in terms of trends regarding this, specific aspect of foreign fighters in South Asia as well, apart from what you've already mentioned? And because we saw that there were low numbers, what do you, how do you view this from your perspective?
Helen, you are saying two things. Are we focusing on Indian foreign fighters gravitating towards Afghanistan, that now Afghanistan is under the Taliban, or you are taking it to Daesh, Middle East? Please be specific.
Both ways, in fact, because at one point they joined Daesh in Iraq and Syria, but then they also joined Daesh in Afghanistan, the Kerala cohort specifically. So we saw that Afghanistan became a certain hotspot at one point from 2017 onwards, after people went over to Iraq and Syria. So both are interconnected in one way or the other, especially because Daesh would probably want to call a lot more volunteers, and they have been trying to with their Voice of Hind and so on.
Okay, so first thing first, that this so-called ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan Province, or we call Daesh in Afghanistan, is something that most experts believe is another Pakistan proxy, which was raised for Afghanistan, because Taliban didn't want to hit the civilian targets, the soft targets, through the talks, peace talks. And also it was a good honey trap, because when the Daesh surfaced in the Middle East, there was a real fear that a lot of Afghans and Pakistanis could actually join Daesh, or could actually create a real wilaya, a real province in AFPAC region. The sectarian fault lines are really deep in Pakistan, if not in Afghanistan. So there are multiple reasons as to why this happened. So I'm one of those who believe that this ISKP, this Daesh in Afghanistan, is nothing but a Pakistani proxy. And I've written about it also, giving reasons. And so this Daesh, this ISKP was claiming attacks on soft targets, while Taliban was claiming attacks on Afghan security forces, the hard targets, as they were, proceeding with the so-called peace talks, which actually never resulted in anything, and Taliban took over forcibly. That was ISKP. It was not a regular province of the blue-blooded Daesh operating out of Syria and Iraq. And it's a big topic in itself. So I think it wouldn't be, we don't have time to comment on it. So that is one. Now there is this ISKP has again become very active in terms of attacking the Taliban now. And that's a very interesting thing which is going on between Afghanistan and Pakistan, because now TTP, taking shelter in Afghanistan, is attacking Pakistani forces. So it is tit for tat. So it's just a matter of convenience as to which group you're going to use to claim the attacks that you want to claim. This is an old AFPAC, dynamics which is at play. We've seen it for a number of decades, and the same thing we've seen. Now, the important point is that this ISKP, though command and control structure remained with the Pak deep state, the online recruitment or offline recruitment was actually done in the name of Daesh, because that is the time Daesh was gaining traction. So some people from Bangladesh, some Indians, some people from Jordan, some Central Asians, even so from near and far region actually joined ISKP, believing that this was true Daesh and they were coming to Afghanistan to fight, because this Daesh held some small territory in the province of Nangarhar, bang on the border with Khyber, where Pakistani army is sitting right across the Durand line. It was so funny. And but it happened that believing that they were joining Daesh and they were going to a Daesh-held territory in Afghanistan, these foreign fighters, including Indians, they joined. And all this has come out in the interviews that they've given, in what their parents have said and what the investigating agencies have said. It's all out there in the open. I'm reading from there, I'm quoting from there. So it was a very classic case whereby the command and control rest locally, and the foreign fighters were recruited from all over. Now, can that ISKP phenomena be repeated in Afghanistan? I would say it looks very unlikely, because I think that ISKP does not hold a territory at all, because Taliban is hell-bent on saying that there is no Daesh in Afghanistan, and they have different reasons for saying so. Taliban have very interesting reasons to say why they're saying there is no Daesh here. And they don't hold territory. So because of which, unless there is territory with the foreign group, foreign fighters will not go. So I do not see this ISKP gaining traction in Afghanistan. Yes, we may see a new game in AFPAC, and I'm forever open to looking for those games and tricks. And we may have Daesh in some other form very soon. And that this radicalization and online recruitment may again start poaching Bangladeshis, Indians. It may start. So I guess I just hope the experts here keep their defenses up and they are looking at it all very carefully. Just yesterday, there was an attack I think yesterday or day before, in Shibi in Balochistan, which has now been claimed by what they call Islamic State, Pakistan province, ISPP, something which has been really lying low for 2 years or 3 years of its existence. And suddenly now you have this ISPP sprung up. Why does it happen? It happens because the Daesh platforms are available to anybody. Any local group can claim any attack, mount any attack, and get it claimed on their website or their. So it's again a game that Daesh worldwide is playing. I hope if I've answered your question on Afghanistan.
Thank you, ma'am. Sushant sir, I just wanted to also check in with you about, ma'am had spoken about ISKP, but there has also been some interest of Islamic State of Daesh as well as Al Qaeda in Kashmir as well, whereas they haven't been able to penetrate it as much as the local groups over there. However, and related to the issue of foreign fighters, do we still see a flow of foreign fighters coming into Kashmir right now? Is it still seen as an attractive, place to be, or have other places eclipsed that over time? And what sort of trends do you see from that angle?
So, Sinan, I'll make 3 or 4 points very, very quickly. One, on the basic ISKP thing. I think the associations are very murky. And very often we tend to look at in very discrete and black and white terms. But from whatever I have read, there are very strong reasons to believe that there is a Pakistani hand behind the rise of ISKP. But there are also very strong reasons or manifest events which inform us that they are not necessarily in complete control of ISKP. They might have prompted it, they might have raised it as a kind of a counter, but how much of control do they exercise? Number two, many of the ISKP operations, for example, in Balochistan, and this the Pakistanis very often hide, even when they target security forces, they make sure they're targeting the Shias and the Pakistani security forces. Okay. This the Pakistanis gloss over, just like they glossed over, the bombing in the Imam Barga the other day, which the Shia said is a Shia genocide, but the Pakistani state kind of covered it up that no, only Pakistanis have died, and that this is becoming a major fault line going forward. So one is that aspect, and I don't think we should ignore it. Another, just one thing before I come to the Kashmir part, and I think it is very important for us to question some of the assumptions on the basis of which we are making some analyses. I'm not saying those assumptions are wrong, but I think there are some question marks around those assumptions. For example, Sinan, you were talking about the Taliban now being responsible for governance. Okay. Well, yes, technically they are responsible for governance, but how does that mean that they are not going to be involved in that entire ideological, battle space or mind space for the ideological, purity of the movement? Why do we assume that is not going to be part and parcel of this? Why do we assume that many of the things they will do is just a kind of just to showcase, just to please some of the West, so that they can get their business through, but in substance they will continue to doing what they are doing? Why do we assume that they are not, they are that, and this is something which infuriates me, because this was the typical Western think tank propaganda which has been fed down everybody's throat. That no, the Taliban are actually very nationalistic people. They have no reason to go beyond Afghanistan, which is the biggest nonsense I've ever heard in my life. Because they have always interacted with and always operated in conjunction with international jihadist groups. So to say that they are entirely Afghanistan based and nothing to do with anywhere else, it's utter nonsense, right? And yet, the so-called Afghan experts in America will keep feeding this nonsense to us, even now. And these fancy think tanks with fancy salaries, I don't know what nonsense they feed everybody, but and there is evidence after evidence after evidence to suggest that the Taliban will not sever their links with these terror groups. They will use these terror groups, and there are now reasons to believe that the Taliban ambitions are not limited. Yeah, come on, Sinan, you tell me, how can an Amirul Mu'minin only be for a country?
Right.
Don't call him an Amirul Mu'minin, you call him a Sipahi Salar. If you call him an Amirul Mu'minin, he has to be for the entire Islamic community. So if he is Amirul Mu'minin, then you have to extend your sway into Pakistan. You have to extend it into Central Asia. Iran has to be, because of its Shia identity, it is an apostate state. It has to be captured. You have to. This is the mindset of many of these people. You might enter into temporary accommodations, as indeed the Taliban have done. But does that mean that they have changed? So, why are we proceeding on those assumptions? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Just very short on Kashmir. Look, we haven't seen, there have been these groups. There are some young people who are probably, seduced by, the sexy propaganda of, some of these groups. But I think the numbers are still small, even of the local recruits, number one. Number two, we haven't really seen any real evidence of groups like the Al-Qaeda or the IS actually striking roots in Kashmir. So yes, there is some chatter. Yes, there is some activity, but I don't think that activity has reached a point where it actually becomes a major threat. And one reason for that is that a lot of what happens in Kashmir comes from across the border. And I'm not entirely convinced that the Pakistanis would like an IS or an Al-Qaeda label to come into Kashmir, because number one, it busts that entire propaganda of the Pakistanis that this is a movement for national liberation and all that nonsense, which they keep spouting and have been spouting for 70 years. So that crap won't sell anymore, okay, if you give it an Al-Qaeda or a IS label. So I don't think they would want that, number one. It's bad enough to have Hizbul Mujahideen and all these other names which, scare the West. Bad enough, which is why you now have those newfangled, nice sounding named anti-fascist front and stuff like that. The wokes in America would love an anti-fascist front and love to back it without knowing what the hell that bloody group is all about. So one is the labeling part of it. The second is the command and control part of it, because Al-Qaeda and IS is not going to be under ISI control completely. They will, even the local groups are not entirely always in ISI control. So that is the second. And the third is, since the ISI calibrates the, the movement across the border, I think they will probably try and keep a lid for as long as is possible on some of these groups. Some might still infiltrate, on their own, but as a concerted kind of a thing to push these guys in, I have not really seen any evidence of that as well.
All right. Thank you. I mean, again, a lot of the things that you've brought out over here, right? These are important things to consider, given that we go around with certain assumptions in mind, thinking that, oh well, this is how, this is how it's supposed to be. But of course, that's not always the case. There might be a popular narrative that we are following, which doesn't necessarily need to be true. And I think what you brought out over here was that how we can challenge some of these assumptions in mind. Now, keeping this, keeping this discussion, I wanted to move over to Shafi, and just for the whole panel, we are done with 45 minutes of our discussion. We have 15 minutes to go, so I will ask the remaining panelists a question each, and then one question thrown out to everybody for their final thoughts. All right. So Shafi, Sushant just mentioned specifically about the issue of Taliban wanting to, obviously, being expansionist in its orientation, in its outlook, if not now, in a short while later, right? So there have been reports, and as soon as we saw that in September, we saw that the Taliban's really moving forward in its campaigns, and it's going to ensure that it takes control. We saw reports of Bangladeshis either wanting to or actually traveling to Afghanistan right after that. There were maybe 2 or 3 reports, and I think the commissioner at that point of Bangladesh had specifically pointed out to this. So since you already said that there were some fears from the last few waves, right? What can you tell us about, is there such interest right now, and what goes on from here? Like how does Bangladesh deal with this? Like how have they been viewing the rise of the Taliban specifically for their security aspects?
First of all, can I clarify 1 or 2 issues that already discussed by the Anjuman and Sushant Sareen? That the debate over the ISKP, actually, this is a very puzzle for me. I have been studying last maybe 10 years about this radicalization process. And what I find, especially the rise of ISIS, I'm not talking about Al-Qaeda, the rise of ISIS, and that was basically the ideological radicalization. And because they had a physical land in Syria and Iraq, they had a physical land as well as a Khalifa. So actually that attracted a lot of young youths to join the ISIS, especially for this radicalization, this wave of radicalization. That is because of the physical Khalifa and physical land for them. And both of them gone. So they don't have any physical land and they don't have the Khalifa right now. So actually, this is a very puzzle for me. Why still how ISIS is still surviving? To my analysis, ISIS has lost both. ISIS has lost its ideological strong points, what should I say? Already they have lost its ideological standpoint. So I think this is something else. This is not directly ISKP and the ISIS or Daesh. Is not the similar thing. This is the one thing. And the secondly, as Taliban has already in the state authority, so they have left where they were last 20 years. So they were holding an establishment narrative. So already they have come to the authority. So that means now they are allying with some of the Western countries. Look at the Doha Treaty in 2020. So they are somehow trying to survive in the globalized world. Otherwise, look at how their state has become fragile in terms of in different perspective. So I would say, to some extent, whether it is ISKP or is something else, maybe another anti-establishmentarian terrorist organization might grow out of this fragile situation in Afghanistan. And on another note, the way Sushant Sareen said, then what is the solution? If we have seen the US troops were there for 20 years, and how that invasion sparked terrorist activities around the world, and how even their narrative, I have gone through the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatever extremist groups are, they have used this invasion as a strong railing point for them. So this invasion actually in other way that sparked radicalization around the world. So I don't know what's the solution. Your concerns are okay. That might also, the Taliban comes to the state power. That might also spark another wave of radicalization. I also believe that way. But we don't know what is the actual solution to it. In either way, there is a dilemma for us. So we can't be sure that either the invasion or the Taliban in power in both ways is going to cause the radicalization. It's true. The Sinan you mentioned very rightly. Yes, some Bangladeshis have tried to enter Afghanistan after the Taliban's takeover, and there might be, and their agenda is not yet clear. How many Bangladeshis have already traveled? So we don't have that information yet, but definitely that inspiration, maybe not Taliban directly will help instill the Sharia law in Bangladesh, but that might have, inspirational thing might be there, that a group of people might be inspired by the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan. That's what I can say at this stage.
Shafi, can I just say something?
Yeah, sure.
Sinan, where I probably disagree with Shafi is that actually after 9/11 and when the invasion took place, it actually broke the back of most terror organizations and terror groups around the world for almost 3 years. I'm not defending how the Americans prosecuted this war. They made a complete hash of it. They had no understanding of the place. Obviously not, since they're the same scholars who were advising them earlier are now telling them Taliban are good guys. So this was the level of silliness in the American academia. So they didn't understand the place. They didn't know how to operate out there. They made a complete half shot of it. But regardless of that, for the first 3 or 4 years after the invasion, there was absolutely, Afghanistan was as safe as any other place in the world. Number one. Number two, please remember that most of the terror groups which were operating were running for their life. Their chatter had virtually stopped at least in 2002 and 2003. In 2004, it again restarted. But that was because the Americans were making a hash of things. And then they continue to make a hash of things for the next 18 years. But to say that the invasion actually triggered off this response is not entirely correct. Number one. Number two, it's not my case that you combat it through invasions. That's not necessarily the solution. There are other more sensible ways of combating it, but which I don't know, with the current wokeness in fashion, whether those solutions are likely to be acceptable or not.
All right. I think, and that's the discussion that both of you all had just now is something that we need to keep in mind, which is that all of these aspects of radicalism are multifaceted. At the end of the day, to say that one aspect or the other is the primary reason or the primary set of reasons is, I believe it's always erroneous in academia. So, again, building off on the previous discussions, I want to go to Chayanika for our last question, after which I will just throw open one question for everyone, which is, Chayanika, Sushant sir had also mentioned about, the Taliban not severing its links. And this is the other aspect of the question that I'd asked you previously, which is that, there are multiple reports of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, for example, being supported by the Taliban, right? And no matter the fact, in fact, the Taliban at one point even denied that they even exist there, made some very weird claims after this. Now, Al-Qaeda,
they even denied TTP exists in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of such weird claims keep coming out, right? Now, the fact is that at the end of the day, Al-Qaeda has always been one such group which has trained people from across the world, right? And given that, like, from your perspective, having, like, whatever you've researched on Afghanistan, are you aware of such sort of, training still occurring? Because their links are not broken yet. They have a lot more of a safe space to operate, that is Al-Qaeda. And the fact is that they now have the ability to, train more people from outside, call more people from outside, which is foreign fighters in what we're looking at, right? So what do you see what sort of trends do you see along these lines, specifically in Afghanistan?
Thanks, Sinan, for that. Before I answer that question of yours, I just wanted to comment on one thing, that we are dealing with a country that exists not the same way as India does for certain, or Pakistan does, or Bangladesh does. We're talking about a country that for the last 50 years or so has been governed in a manner which is almost as absent and as amorphous as it can be. So we cannot talk about a country like Afghanistan without talking about the issue of governance, which is where I would also agree and also disagree with Sushant sir, who said that it's not really a matter of governance, it's very much a matter of governance. And if I recall this academic scholar called Gilles Laurent accurately, he had said that one of the reasons why Afghanistan is not balkanizing is also because the countries around Afghanistan do not want a part of Afghanistan to be a part of them. So I think we need to take into account the fact that the political organization of this country is extremely different, is extremely, what should I say, it's very different from the kind of stuff what we've been used to in the other parts of South Asia, be it India, be it Pakistan, be it Bangladesh, which exist as state for their own sake as well. Right now in Afghanistan, it almost feels like a cluster of networks and organizations which are being made to sustain for a variety of reasons, which can be narcotics, which can be trafficking of other stuff, etc., etc. So that's one. And I also would like to agree with what Anju ma'am had also said about the ISKP for me as well. And I do not really gather data as much as Anju ma'am does, but I have anecdotal information from people who I have been working with in Afghanistan and who have told me that all of this sounds almost like a straw man. The ISKP sounds like a straw man, and the whole bogey about Taliban being this and that, I think that at this point of time has kind of come to an end for the simple reason that the Taliban is in power, whether we like it or not. Whether it governs in a specific way or it does not govern in a specific way, that's completely, I think, for all of us to decide and talk about. But the fact that the Taliban is in power at this point of time makes it almost, there's a saying in Hindi, right? Ulta chor kotwal ko date. So at the end of the day, both the thief and the police happens to be the same entity. So we need to take that into account as well. And as far as the transnational aspirations of Taliban is concerned, I completely agree with Sushant Sareen sir, because an organization, an entity that was formed exogenously, I cannot expect that organization to not have transnational aspirations. What it could perhaps do, and which is where I think Al-Qaeda and the ISIS come into play, is that they can use it as a veneer for plausible deniability. So as you asked me in your question as well, they would keep calling people from different parts of the world to be trained to spread their propaganda, to spread a particular set of ideology, and the Taliban would continue doing that for the simple reason that it happens to be an ideological organization before anything else. It's not simply an insurgent movement because it ceases to be an insurgency the moment it comes to power. It's an ideological organization which is being challenged by factions which are as small as the ISKP and the stuff that you have quoted in your paper as well, that there are people who are challenging what the Taliban has done. So Taliban, to avoid itself from imploding, I think it will continue to use Al-Qaeda, it will continue to use ISIS as a tool of propaganda, as a kind of veneer to keep itself intact, and at the same time continue to exist in Afghanistan, try and claim some sort of legitimacy from the rest of the world so that it can draw the economic flows that at this point of time it has been completely barred from. So that's, I think, where the Taliban, I think, finds itself in both a catch-22, but at the same time, it can use this particular catch-22 and give it a positive spin for itself, if not necessarily for Afghanistan, by continuing to ensure that the Al-Qaeda becomes a front for its ideological propaganda. Because if Al-Qaeda has given an oath of allegiance to Akhundzada, there's every reason for us to believe that it continues to exist in Afghanistan. And the Taliban wouldn't really want to detach itself from an organization which can help it further its transnational agenda. Whether it is, I am not familiar with the Taliban having an agenda to establish a caliphate, but going by what Sareen sir had also said, that you would not really call yourself an Amirul Momineen if you were not having transnational agenda at the heart of your ideological organization. But I've not really come across anything in particular that would suggest to the effect that the Taliban would want a caliphate of the same sort that the ISIS does, but the transnational agenda can be of a different kind. And given that the Taliban for a good period of time had existed and has existed as an ideological organization with extra national networks, be it narcotic networks or be it something else. So I think they would continue to make money out of it, and money being the major impetus right now with everything drying up for Afghanistan, I think that's a front that it will create for itself just to keep itself going.
All right. Thank you so much, Chayanika. And your final point, which is that transnational ambitions don't necessarily, it doesn't play out the way Daesh does. At the end of the day, everyone in South Asia is going to, be the most concerned because that's the closest, that's closest to the Taliban, right? And so in that, I will just ask one final question after which we close. So if everybody could give me just maybe half a minute to 1 minute of your thoughts, which is, we've been thinking about this from an individual country perspective. But how do we, as a South Asian, a region specifically, right? How does cooperation come into this play to prevent, the issue of foreign fighters, to prevent the issue of radicalization that stems from it and that has led to it, right? I know this is a tricky question. I know that at the end of the day, we've tried and we've failed significantly. But are there any new factors that have propped up in let's say from the year 2022, which necessitates or which can facilitate cooperation a little bit better than what we've had over the last 70, 80 years or so? Any thoughts, from everybody? Maybe we'll go Anju ma'am first and Sushant Sareen sir later, Shafi, and then Chayanika. So.
See, the cooperation actually depends on bilateral relations, and bilateral relations go 360 degrees. You may have very good political, economic bilateral, but you may not have good, bilateral on counterterrorism or stuff like that. So we know the status of our bilaterals within South Asia. The multilateral forum is SARC, which is not to be, which I don't think has any major success so far. So the bilateral is something that I think everybody will try and improve. That's my understanding. Secondly, I think everybody must be trying to figure out Taliban. And Taliban itself is trying to figure out if at all Taliban can govern Afghanistan, because they're under pressure from the Northern Resistance Front, the minority groups which are there in the northern part. They are through TTP, they are fighting against the Pak forces. One level, they are not very comfortable with their, the Central Asian states and Iran. They haven't got recognition. They're fighting for humanitarian assistance. They do not have, the skills, the resources to be a modern state. And they're not even claiming to be one. They're talking about deploying suicide units. So I think as much as Taliban is trying to figure out, where it stands, what it can do, who it will be, cozying up with the transnational groups or whatever. I think the South Asian region and far beyond South Asian region, everybody will try and figure this out. The answers haven't come out as yet. This is a very fluid situation. It is developing very rapidly, something that I think we need to keep looking at. For example, if the common threats is, say, emerging for Bangladesh and India. So I'm sure given a very robust bilateral relationship, this is something which will definitely happen. So, and all of this will not come out in public domain, that we all know. But common threats will definitely come out in public domain. But as I said, I think it is too early, and it is too early to pass any judgment whatsoever on anything which is developing in Afghanistan and threats emanating out of, I would say, even AFPAC, because Pakistan has become unstable too. It's not that Pakistan has not become unstable. Pakistan has become unstable because of what has happened in Afghanistan. So I would like to call it AFPAC. That's all I can say to just now. Thank you.
Sushant sir?
So two very quick points. I don't think the Taliban give a damn about the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. that's just their backdoor to recognition and nothing more than that. It's not affecting their lifestyle. And I don't see how they've ever been bothered about the well-being of Afghans. But on the other question of the foreign fighters, Sinan, you can try bilateral cooperation and you can try multilateral cooperation and whatever else you might. But I think this issue transcends all those cooperative mechanisms you might work out. I don't think that this phenomena is contingent on what kind of cooperation you can have, because it's far bigger than that. And frankly, if you go back into history, you'll see parallels. We've seen foreign fighters coming into India for 1,000 years, coming out here, becoming adventurers, settling down, some even forming empires out here, right? If not an empire, at least a small principality, if nothing else. So this was a phenomena which is not new. This is a phenomena which is quite old. It's a phenomena which has been revived, and there are no easy answers on how to stop this phenomena. Wherever there is a theater of conflict, you will see foreign fighters in one way or another traveling out there, also given how easy it is now to travel to these places and how expendable these people are. So that's bound to happen. There is an entire political economy around this.
All right, thank you. Mr. Shafi, more to add?
Yeah, I think we need to stop the radicalization process. We need to find out why they are being radicalized. If they're not radicalized, there is no point to travel. So first of all, they will have to find out why they are being radicalized. And good governance is a main indicator that needs to be ensured. The marginalization of the minorities, that needs to be stopped in some South Asian countries. And of course, the intelligence sharing can be one of the best options to stop foreign fighters. Yeah.
Okay. All right. With its obvious challenges, though, Chayanika, any other points to add?
Given the drift of our conversation, I think we can actually go back to Afghanistan and perhaps really save it from imploding, because right now, if the estimates are to be believed, whether you'd like to believe them or not, 97% of the population would go below the poverty line. And radicalization is not just a result of ideological motive. It's not just motivated ideologically. It's also, as Sareen sir has also pointed out, it's a political economic concept, and you would basically gravitate towards whatever that gives you food on your table. So I think we really need to make sure that the crisis that is currently brewing in Afghanistan stops, because that can once again allow Afghanistan to become a fountainhead of radicalism, which need not necessarily be ideologically motivated, but because of something as basic as survival is at stake.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists who've come here. We've had an animated discussion. We've had exchanges and people engaging with each other. And I think this is what we wanted, to stimulate some level of debate and some level of discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to discuss this, because these are topics that are huge in and of itself, but we only had an hour approximately to discuss this. So with that, once again, thank you to everybody for participating, for agreeing to come here, for taking your time off for this. We really appreciate this at ORF, and we hope to see you and continue engagements with every one of you as we move along from here. Thank you so much.